Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the quiet mountains of Appalachia, stories linger like shadows, whispered in barns, buried in cellars, tucked into the corners of family photographs that were never meant to see daylight. But there is one story that does not whisper. It screams through time, raw and unbearable. A child, 9 years old, still clinging to her dolls and bedtime songs, was forced to carry life inside her. Not by the choice of innocence, but by the weight of a family curse. Inbreeding so severe it twisted bloodlines into cages. She became both daughter and mother, victim and proof of a cycle that had already stolen generations. And yet the town kept silent, the hills swallowing the truth, because shame is often stronger than justice in places where secrets mean survival. This is not a legend, this is not folklore, this is what happens when love is replaced with obsession, and blood becomes both the key and the lock. Tonight, we step into the darkest chamber of Appalachia's forgotten history. A story of the most inbred daughter ever recorded. Her name has been blurred by time, but her suffering has not. To understand her, we must first understand the land itself. Appalachia is not just geography, it is isolation made flesh. Mountains so tall they cut people off from the rest of the world, generations trapped in hollows and valleys where strangers rarely came, and neighbors were often kin. In such soil, poverty grew thick, and with poverty came desperation, men who could not afford to leave, women who had no choice but to stay, families who leer to survive not by reaching outward, but by turning inward, sometimes too far inward. Blood ties became twisted vines, wrapping tighter and tighter until escape was impossible. By the time this little girl was born, her family tree was already withering. The branches did not stretch out. They curled back upon themselves, broken and brittle. Cousins had married cousins. Brothers had shared wives. Fathers had claimed daughters. Every new child carried the weight of the past in their bones. Crooked spines, crossed eyes, frail bodies. But what happened to her was worse than deformity. She became a living testimony to the darkest truth, that even innocence could be consumed when family boundaries collapsed. The night she was discovered, doctors whispered in disbelief. 9 years old, belly swollen, eyes empty. The town told itself lies. Maybe she had been taken advantage of by an outsider. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But the truth was written in her bloodline. The father of her child was no stranger. He was family, and everyone who had looked away was guilty. The mountains keep secrets well. They roll and fold like blankets, muffling cries, trapping stories where outsiders cannot hear them. In Appalachia, silence was not weakness. It was survival. To speak against your kin meant exile. To admit the truth meant shame so great it could stain generations. And so, when the girl's pregnancy became undeniable, her family did what many before them had done. They hid it in plain sight. Neighbors looked away. Churchgoers mumbled prayers without questions. The doctor, when he confirmed the impossible, scribbled notes carefully, never daring to say aloud what those notes meant. Because everyone knew, and no one wanted to know. She was not the first. That is the part people forget. Across the hills, whispers of child brides and daughters stolen from childhood had long been traded behind closed doors. It was not spoken of in newspapers, for journalists rarely made their way into the deep hollows. It was not shouted from pulpits, for preachers were often part of the same tangled bloodlines. Instead, it was passed down in the heavy silences at family gatherings, in the awkward glances when a girl bore a child far too young. Generations normalized the unthinkable until it became a pattern carved into bone. But with her, something changed. Because she was only 9, Her innocence was undeniable, her age too young for the town's usual justifications. They could not call it marriage, they could not say she was old enough. The truth shone like a wound, raw and unhealed, and it unsettled even those who had learned to look the other way. Still, the family built a wall of secrecy around her. They claimed it was God's will. They insisted it was better to keep quiet than to bring shame to the family name. And so, her small body carried the weight of not just a child, but of an entire community's silence. Imagine her nights, 9 years old, clutching a rag doll in one hand and her stomach with the other, confused by the changes she could not understand. Her childhood slipping away with every heartbeat. In the darkness of that cabin, she became a prisoner of blood, of silence, of men who saw daughters not as children, but as possessions, and the hills, with their ancient silence, bore witness without judgment. Because in Appalachia, the truth wasn't hidden, it was buried alive. The story of this girl is not only about a single act of cruelty, but about the soil that grew it. Poverty in Appalachia was not simply a lack of money, it was an inheritance as suffocating as the mountains themselves. Families trapped by coal companies, crushed under debts, bound to land they could not escape. Education was scarce, doctors were rare, and the idea of opportunity lived only in stories carried back by those who left. For most, leaving was a dream, but staying was survival. And when survival is the only language spoken, morality often bends until it breaks. In hollows where outsiders rarely set foot, families became worlds unto themselves. Isolation, generation after generation, bred desperation. Cousins married cousins, not because of tradition, but because there were no others. The gene pool shrank until deformities became common. Bent spines, hollow eyes, jaws that never formed properly. Children born carrying the punishment of their ancestors' choices. And within this decay, darker customs took root. The line between father and husband, sister and wife, blurred. What should have been unthinkable became routine, defended with scripture twisted into chains. By the time the girl was born, her family's blood was already weakened by decades of turning inward. She never had a chance to grow without the weight of it pressing on her. The adults around her had been shaped by the same cycle, each generation passing on not only their names, but their silence. When her body began to swell, it was not just biology. It was history repeating itself with brutal precision. She was a vessel, not a child, carrying the proof of sins no one dared to name. But what makes her story so haunting is not only the act itself, but the community's complicity. Imagine a town where everyone knows, where every pair of eyes looks away. Imagine a preacher who chooses verses about Obed, over verses about justice. Imagine neighbors who hear the rumors, who see the girl's belly grow, yet say nothing because to speak would mean tearing down the fragile order holding their own lives together. Silence was their currency, and they spent it lavishly on the suffering of a child. And so the girl, just 9 years old, lived through months of horror in a world that pretended nothing was happening. Her childhood had been stolen not by strangers, but by the very people meant to protect her. That is the darkest truth of Appalachia, not that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen. When the baby finally came, it was not a moment of joy, but of dread. The girl, still more a child than a mother, screamed in confusion and terror as her body tore under the weight of labor it was never meant to endure. 9 years old, bones too soft, hips too narrow, yet forced to bring life into a world that had already taken hers. Witnesses later whispered that she did not cry after the birth. Not from relief, not from happiness. She simply stared, hollow and exhausted, as if something inside her had died long before that night. The child she bore was not just a baby. It was evidence of a cycle so vile that every member of the family wanted it erased. They dressed the baby in secrecy, baptized it in silence, and invented lies to explain its existence. Some claimed it was her younger sibling, others suggested she had been attacked by an outsider, a nameless figure conjured to take the blame. But the truth lingered in the baby's face, features too familiar, too close to home. Blood does not lie, no matter how fiercely a family wishes it could. And so the girl became invisible in her own story. She was given no comfort, no justice, no protection. She was a living reminder of shame and in the twisted logic of her community that made her guilty. Instead of shielding her, they shunned her. Instead of mourning her lost innocence, they guarded the family name. She was left alone with the weight of a child in her arms, her own childhood buried before it had even begun. Doctors who knew the truth buried it in their notes, unwilling to fight against the silence of the mountains. Officials turned their heads, unwilling to bring scandal into the light. Even historians, when they stumbled across fragments of her story decades later, often softened the edges, calling it rumor or exaggeration. But the reality was harsher than rumor could ever be. A girl became a mother, not by choice, not by fate, but by the crushing inevitability of a bloodline turned inward. The hills of Appalachia are filled with unmarked graves. We do not know if hers became one of them, but even if her body disappeared into the earth, her story remains. It whispers in the wind through abandoned cabins. It lingers in family Bibles with names scratched out. It waits for those willing to listen, not to the proud legends of Appalachia, but to the horrors hidden in its shadows. If you're still here, still listening to this story, you're already braver than most. Because the truth we're unearthing is not the kind that makes people comfortable. It's the kind that makes people turn off the lights a little quicker, or glance at the family portraits on their walls and wonder what they don't know. So let me ask you, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If silence was the only thing standing between survival and ruin, tell me in the comments, because these stories only live when people are willing to confront them. The tragedy of the 9-year-old mother was not an isolated wound. It was part of a pattern that spread across generations. Appalachia was filled with families who wore shame like a second skin. Inbreeding did not begin with her, and it did not end with her. Long before she was born, marriages between cousins had been justified as practical. Travel was dangerous, communities were cut off, and poverty left few choices, but practicality over time curdled into horror. When cousins no longer sufficed, some turned to siblings. When siblings no longer sufficed, daughters became prey. What started as survival became a cycle of consumption, each generation devouring the innocence of the next. And the cost was written in their bodies. Doctors reported children born blind, with twisted limbs, with jaws that never grew. Some could not speak, some could not walk. Yet instead of stopping, families continued, because shame was a chain stronger than love. They would rather endure deformity, rather endure whispers, than admit what they had done. The 9-year-old was just one link in that chain, pulled tight until it snapped in the form of a swollen belly that no one could deny. But here lies the deeper wound. The land itself seemed to conspire in their silence. The isolation that trapped families also protected them from outside eyes. Dirt roads wound into valleys where no lawmen bothered to go. Cabins stood hidden in the trees, smoke curling from chimneys as though nothing was amiss. The mountains became both shield and prison, keeping judgment out and keeping secrets in. The girl's suffering was not only permitted by people, but by place. Geography itself became her captor. And so, while the outside world told stories of Appalachian resilience, of coal miners and mountain folk with grit, the darker story stayed buried. Only in rare cases like hers did the truth slip through the cracks. Only then do we catch a glimpse of what lay beneath the folklore, a history built on blood, silence, and the destruction of childhood. As years passed, the story of the 9-year-old mother became less of a memory and more of a ghost. Families who knew the truth pretended they didn't. Her name was erased from conversations, her child raised under lies, her pain folded into the fabric of silence that Appalachia had woven for generations. And yet, that silence never truly erased her. It only transformed her into something else, an unspoken warning, a shadow haunting those who carried the same blood. In whispers, she became the girl no one wanted to mention, but everyone remembered. Her child, too, bore the scars of the cycle. Born into the same isolation, raised among the same twisted vines of family, the child never escaped the weight of shame. Even if the baby survived physically, it carried the mark of its origins, an inheritance too heavy for any human being to bear. And so the bloodline staggered forward, broken but unbroken, feeding on itself with the same grim determination that had already claimed countless before them. The question we must ask is this: why was nothing ever done? Why was the cycle allowed to continue, generation after generation? The answer lies in the corrosive mix of poverty, religion, and pride. Poverty made people desperate, willing to look away if it meant food on the table. Religion was twisted into a shield, words of scripture used to justify acts that should have been condemned. And pride, perhaps the deadliest of all, made families choose silence over truth, even when truth might have saved the innocent. Pride protected the family name, but it destroyed the family itself. Her story forces us to look at the cost of silence, to see how entire communities can conspire, not through action, but through inaction. And it asks us to confront something even darker, that sometimes the greatest horrors are not committed by outsiders, but by those closest to us. She was not destroyed by strangers. She was destroyed by blood. Somewhere in those mountains her cabin may still stand. The wood rotted, the roof caved in, but the silence remains. Step inside, and you would not hear laughter or songs or prayers. You would feel the weight of a history too heavy for walls to carry. A history that seeps into the floorboards, into the earth, into the very air. Her story does not rest, because it was never allowed to be told. Until now, and now, as we close this chapter, we must return to the image we began with, a 9-year-old child forced into a role no child should ever endure. She is not folklore. She is not a ghost story told to frighten children. She was real. She lived, she breathed, and she carried the unbearable proof of a family's sin within her own small body. History has tried to bury her, but her silence speaks louder than the lies told to erase her. Appalachia is often painted with romantic colors. Hard-working miners, resilient families, traditions passed down like heirlooms. But the truth that few dare to confront, is that beneath the surface lies a legacy of secrecy and sorrow. The mountains may look beautiful from a distance, but up close they hide wounds carved deep into the lives of those who lived there, wounds like hers, a story that should never have happened, but did, and will continue to haunt anyone who dares to look too closely. What her life reveals is not just the horror of incest, nor the brutality of inbreeding. It reveals how communities allow evil to grow when silence is easier than justice. She became a mother at 9 because no one stopped it. She suffered because no one spoke. And in that silence, we see the most frightening truth of all, that it is not always the monsters outside our doors who destroy us. Sometimes it is the blood within, the people we are taught to trust, the walls we are told will keep us safe. Her story is a mirror, held up to a country that prefers not to look at its own reflection. But if we dare to stare, if we dare to listen, we see that she is still here, in every whisper about Appalachian secrets, in every family that hides its darkest truths, in every unmarked grave that holds a child who never had a chance. She was 9 years old, and she was with child. That is not a tale to entertain. That is a wound that demands to be remembered. Because only by remembering do we stop the silence from claiming another generation. Her name may be lost, but her story will not be, not anymore. Would you like me to also craft you a chilling outro line that directly invites viewers to subscribe while keeping the haunting tone?